Oh, didn't see you there, fellas. It's been a little while, hasn't it? Well, been kind of busy doing around, had to move from one location to the other, and now, well, I'm back at this spot, which will probably be the last spot that I'm going to be in until I move. But anyway, let's get on with the topic of today's video, which today, let's talk about some old school RPGs.
Now, I'm no stranger to good old role-playing games, but when I mention RPG, it might mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. When I say the term, we can think up of Japanese games like the Tales series or Final Fantasy, and we can even go into the other end of the spectrum with something like the Elder Scrolls, Knights of the Old Republic, or The Witcher. But to set up some context, we're gonna have to go back, and I mean way back, to the 90s when the word RPG would stand in for computer role-playing game, where the genre was trying to simulate as best as it can the tabletop role-playing game experience, and generally using the same systems but having the computer do all the roles for you. This is where you can see classic gems like Baldur's Gate or Planescape Torment show up because they're using essentially the 2nd edition advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set as the main system in place to simulate the game world. Creating and managing a character in these games, you would use the same sort of points that you would use on paper to level up your character in a similar way. Your characters would simulate events by using dice rolls, the equivalent of which would be real tabletop dice rolls, but automated by the computer, and the effects would display on screen instead of, using your good old noggin.
So now that we know how these RPGs function, let's talk about one of my favorite ones, and Fallout, a post-apocalyptic RPG.
So if you're an OG, you might have played the original Fallout or Fallout 2, hell, even Fallout Tactics. But for a lot of the fellas out there, you probably thought to yourself, it's kinda weird how this game series started with number 3, to which my response would be, if you think that's weird, I think it's more absurd that I somehow haven't played Fallout 5 through 75. But to be real, the origin of the Fallout franchise started off on PC by a completely different developer known as Black Isle Studios that released Fallout in 1997 and its acclaimed sequel a year later in 1998, and then follow that up with the magnum opus Planescape Torment a year or so after, but that's another story for a different day. What we need to know about these early Fallout games is that before the dawn of the playable first-person shooter, like games like Deus Ex and System Shock 2, they looked and played a lot more rugged with games like the original System Shock or Origins Ultima Underworld. So the newer shooter format wasn't feasible, so instead of even thinking of doing a shooter, the fellas at Black Isle developed a whole new role-playing system called a special system that we see to this day. Special meaning strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. It's from the special system that we really get that tabletop RPG feel to the gameplay. It's why the game is all done on dice rolls, so it fits right up there with games like Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment for some of the best computer role-playing games.
Now the other thing I think we should talk about is that Fallout kind of basically set the stage for, let's say, like post-apocalyptic RPGs.
The fact is that even to this day, we still talk about Fallout as the quintessential post-apocalyptic RPG, and nothing really comes close to it when it comes to both computer RPGs, henceforth known as CRPG, and first-person shooters. Immediately from the get-go with Fallout, we're introduced to an interesting retro-futuristic setting that is probably the reason why I keep coming back to play these games. And when you pair it with that excellent dialogue and wonderful characters, you have a recipe for a great game that will stand the test of time. Now, I said previously that not a lot of games come close to prominence that Fallout has achieved, and to get anything even remotely similar, you're going to have to take a look at to the east, where the conditions of the fallen Soviet Union and a very infamous event can be mixed together to create a different approach to post-apocalyptic settings. Enter some of my favorite games of all time with Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, and Metro 2033, both games made by developers in Ukraine who take their own interesting experiences living under the Soviet boot to create a less hunky-dory future and one that is really bleak to live in. What Metro and Stalker both excel at doing is creating a heavy atmosphere full of dread that perfectly encapsulates the concept of the end of the world. So instead of the Western approach, where we kind of look at post-apocalyptic scenarios as the folly of man, the Eastern approach would signify how awful it is, but highlighting individual moments of humanity.
So for instance, fellas, let's say that we mix the two together. So we'll take the Western approach to RPGs, especially CRPGs, and then we'll take the Eastern approach in aesthetics, so that Soviet bloc sort of, coolness. Now we mix them all together into one little package, and that gets us today's topic, which is, of course, Atom RPG.
Well, the very, let's say appropriately named Atom RPG is developed, of course, by Atom Team, which are a multinational game studio based out of Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Latvia. Atom RPG is an isometric CRPG similar to the Fallout games of old, set in the nondescript wastes that encompass an area in the former Soviet Union. Destroyed in a war that occurred in 1986, while the game takes place nearly 2 decades later in the year 2005, Anno Domini. You take the role of an agent of Atom, a paramilitary and scientific organization tasked with the collection of pre-war technologies and expertise to properly distribute them back to the waste to increase the standard of living of the people in the waste to eventually restore the collapsed Soviet Union. The player is a recent cadet that has been thrust into the waste with his reliable pack and trusty AK, and to go and find General Morozov, who was on a dire mission to stop a threat that could destroy the wastes and everyone in it. So, typical RPG fare, until in classic post-Soviet fashion, you get all your stuff stolen. Now, with nothing but a couple of bricks and your skill set, you are thrusted into the sleepy town of Otradnoye to get your bearings and hopefully get your stuff back.
So seemingly at first it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot to Atom RPG, especially on the narrative end to talk about. So before we get to that in a sec, let's talk about how the game plays.
As I said before, Atom RPG is basically like taking games like Stalker and Metro and putting it into an engine that is similar to the original Fallout games. So if you fellas were looking for something like a shooter, then, go play Fallout or Stalker or Metro. Before you even start the game, you're shown a character creation menu that looks very similar to the special system. It's got a series of attributes and a plethora of skills underneath. Hell, it even allows you to pick a couple traits like in the original OG. I really do enjoy how they do traits in Atom. Instead of just a simple huge gain to a certain skill or attribute, you also have some drawbacks from each one. For instance, you might pick one that has a bonus to healing and endurance, but you're also more susceptible to being a meth head with a 50% chance to get addicted to chems. Another example is a trait that while alone, you get a huge improvement to your character, but the second that you get some companions in there and the skills are drawn back for your character. So instead of picking a trait being a 2-minute affair of, I'm gonna take Bloody Mess and Wild Wasteland, you actually have to think about what you want for more than a couple of seconds, because with the case above, you're making a choice of an easier beginning for a more difficult mid to late game, or vice versa.
So if that description kind of made you feel like you're filling out one of these things, well, you pretty much are. So let's get to the nitty gritty of it.
Immediately, we can see from the top-down isometric view in the RPG mechanics that Atom RPG proudly wears its influences on its sleeve, and it becomes only more apparent. Quests like the RPGs of old are numerous and with a variety of ways that they can be completed, with practically every quest with a sort of non-combative way to complete them, which I find to be rather refreshing. It can be something as simple as using different speech checks to solve a dispute, and even within those circumstances you have multiple options, whether it be charm them with high speechcraft, or use your brawn and spook them into submission, or using your intellect and breaking down their arguments followed by saying, "Hey, you stupid." Sometimes these skills come into effect before a conversation even begins. With a high intellect, you might figure out before talking to some fool that he's drunk off his ass and that maybe more academic arguments aren't going to work with him. Other times, asking a question will only receive a rewarding answer if you have a high enough stat. And I find it interesting, it doesn't tell you when you don't have the stats to get the better dialogue. It's only when you get those options that there might be a variety of different playstyles that elaborate further in conversations that I may or may not have experienced with my current playthrough.
So while like the dialogue and the non-combat options approach to solving a lot of quests is really neat and I really appreciate it, sometimes fellas at the end of the day, you gotta use one of these damn things to get your way around some problems.
Combat in Atom RPG is very similar to our friend of old and mirrors it pretty closely with a system of using action points to determine what you can do in a given turn and how much AP you have and how much certain actions take up will be dependent on your skills. Moving around the map once into combat will consume AP as well will actions like shooting, reloading, switching weapons, or opening up your or someone else's inventory to equip a weapon or some armor. When attacking, you have options by either taking your chances normally or by using more AP to aim at an individual's body parts or appendages. My favorite being the eyes, which fondly reminds me of aiming for the eyes on the death claws in Fallout. You might also have other options given to you depending on the type of weapon that you wield. Using a pistol like some rusty ass Nagant revolver will only get you off a single shot at a time, but change that revolver out for a Kalash and then you could do some bursts of automatic fire to try and blast whatever mutant was unfortunate enough to get in front of you. Of course, just because you got a weapon in your hands doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to hit anything with it, and it's when your stats will be vital to safely and properly use a weapon. In essence, if you don't have the skills in a certain weapon's requirement filled out, then don't expect to hit anything reliably, and that's on top of other things that will affect combat too. So remember that rusty ass Nagant revolver? Well, the conditions of weapons is another thing that you have to worry about in the middle of combat. Now, I'm not really sure how a revolver can jam on you, but I like to think that the timing is messed up, so it doesn't align the cylinders with the barrel and hammer correctly. Tangent aside, if your weapons are rusty as hell, then you're going to be using a lot of AP to clear out jams, so that next time your gun functions normally only to be really unlucky and then jam again.
Now you see fellas, I'm more of a fan of just picking off weapons from the ground from whoever was unfortunate enough to meet my gaze in this barren earth. But if you're not like me and you terrify people to death, well, I'm just saying, you can make your own weapons too if you really want to.
While the original Fallout games didn't have crafting, Atom RPG feels it prudent to add a variety of survival mechanics that you might find more familiar like games in The Forest. While a lot of items can be found in the world, some players might be more frugal with their rubles and craft a lot more regular items needed in every day, such as medkits, ammunition for some of the earlier pipe weapons, and rudimentary armors. I will be honest in saying that I usually don't tend to use crafting mechanics in games unless it is absolutely necessary, since I personally would rather find new stuff while exploring the world than collecting a bunch of trash to turn it into something. But for all the trash goblins among us, then you might enjoy it. There's also a mechanic for hunger that requires a player to have healthy stock of items ready for consumption when the player has a little tummy ache from eating nothing but bread for 3 stinking days. While with crafting, I usually don't get into the habit of using. Hunger is one that you don't necessarily have to worry about all the time, but I find it to be an annoyance that needs to be addressed every 10 or 20 minutes or so. I'll also be honest with the fact that I usually despise hunger and thirst mechanics in a lot of games because I just don't enjoy the busy work of worrying about something so mundane. I think the only game I really enjoy those mechanics is probably Pathologic, since it's done in such a way that the busy work of getting sustenance conflicts with helping other people. But if you want to know more about that, then stay tuned.
Well, that's pretty much all I gotta say with the game mechanics of Atom RPG. But when we come to the narrative elements of Atom RPG, it's, there's a bit more than meets the eye in this game.
Now, fellas, to get something out of the way first, the story of Atom at the very beginning of the game isn't too compelling. You will probably forget all about looking for General Morozov and get bogged down on a series of quests happening in the vicinity of Otradnoe and the factory, which are the first 2 hums you'll likely come across in the game. So story-wise, what makes the game compelling for those that want to play it? To me, it has to be the world that the Wastes inhabit. As odd as it sounds, there's a certain mundane aspect to it that really caught my attention while playing through it. The Wastes don't have the pomp and style of Fallout's retrofuturistic world, so instead Atom Team has inhabited the world with people that don't look too out of place from our own reality. The world isn't quite as devastated as Fallout's, so this civilization, while not coming back up to pre-war levels, has retained a lot of order around it. Instead of the outlandish stories of sending ghouls to the promised land or meeting the deadly remnants of the pre-war government, you'll be dealing with bandit head honchos by hook or by crook trying to make an honest living administrating an area, or settling disputes between guards and tradesmen in a vital city, or solving a set of serial murders in a city long thought dead. Perhaps a portion of what makes this works for me is the fact that a lot of the outlandish elements are toned down to keep the world more grounded, and instead the weirder stuff comes from individuals in the world that suffer from derangement that would not be out of place with your local Butiran addict. But if you were hoping for some more outlandish shish, then fret not, because Adam has an interesting sense of humor. Take for example a circus made up of various freaks from the zone that I'm pretty sure are the game's backers. Or a Jewish librarian that you meet in the main city, that you ask for a copy of Lord of the Rings, only for him to give you a quest to ask you to enact some vengeance on some book burners and shoot him dead. Though my favorite has to probably be a man known as General Nasty, that tasks you with finding the most hideous specimens of fledgling humanity found in the wastes, to bring into a hotel room so he can film the most vile, evil, and deranged pornographic film in the history of man, to discuss society so much that they live a more traditional, less degenerate life for the future of humanity.
I'm not gonna lie, to a lot of you fellas this might seem like a little too generic, a little too mundane, but I don't know, there's just something about this kind of world that really kind of grips me, and I want to see more of it. I don't know why, but it just kind of strikes me in an interesting way.
It doesn't help that some of the companions you get along the way can be a bit absurd, whether it be Fidel, the goofy Russian that you find manning a bar, LARPing as a Cuban, or the good old Soviet boomer Hexagon that will uphold the virtues of the long-gone Soviet Union and seem like a good old-timer to everyone around him. There's also references to many parts of the world that seem to remain largely intact. One of these places is the great city of Trudograd that is actually the subject of Adam's sequel that will release later this year, or by the time you watch this video might have already released. More on Trudograd later, but there's a larger world in this universe that might be interesting to take a look at in future games. For instance, there's this magical land called Tallinn where cassette tapes are made from. Truly a city of wonder that must be visited in this world, though I'm sure the poor excuses for humanity that live there might just be a little deranged. Lastly, for the narrative element of Adam RPG is the world of the waste is one that is slowly reaching the post-apocalypse phase. Society as a whole seems to be sort of intact and it's slowly but surely rebuilding. These kind of post-apocalypse settings are the ones I enjoy the most, when fledgling nations of the new world start to pop up and kind of fall for the follies of the old world. The way I see it is that we've played many games where the bombs just recently dropped and the world is made up of disgusting mutants or cannibals of numerous kinds. In this one, people trying to keep the old Soviet world as intact as it could be, with mixed results. But hey, if you're looking for that Metro or Fallout-esque hyper-collapsed societies, then there's always the Dead City, which is a largely destroyed and abandoned urban center that looks a lot like Metro's Moscow or Fallout 3's Washington, D.C.
So, lastly, before we wrap this baby up, let's talk about the presentation of the game, but more specifically, the thing that probably most people are going to find interesting with this game, which is the post-Soviet aesthetic of it.
Fellas, to be truthful one last time, the most interesting aspect of Adam RPG is that it attempts to take a variety of different influences and puts them all together in a blender to make something truly that I would call unique. We don't really get a lot of post-apocalyptic CRPGs these days, let alone one that takes place in a post-Soviet setting where the common riffraff you'll come across are the people that formerly inhabited it. From Russians to Balts to a selection of individuals from Central Asia, Dagestan, and Chechnya. This is, in my opinion, a part of the world that we really don't see a whole lot of games from, and I'm always welcome to experience, well, new experiences. Seeing things like even the mention of Tallinn, the capital city of Estonia, and a place that I will soon inhabit is a particular kind of treat. And if we get to see more places in the setting that go up to the Baltics, well, I'm gonna be ecstatic. Also, shout out to the Baltic homies, you're number one in the hood, G.
So, with all these aspects put together, I'm very glad to say that Adam RPG gets a very solid 7 out of 10.
Atom RPG to me is an interesting experience, not even so much for what it is, but the potential that it has to become. At the current outset, we're presented with a very solid CRPG that dearly holds its influences on its sleeves, and it's proud of that. You take that hard-to-describe, dreary, post-Soviet setting that you might see in games like Metro or Stalker, crank back the outlandishness a bit, and mix it with the tried-and-true dynamic gameplay of the classic CRPG titles of Fallout and Planescape Torment, and you have a truly unique experience. I think Atom Team is a development studio that fans of the CRPGs should keep an eye on for whatever cool stuff they create next, which seems to be a sequel to Atom RPG Intrudograd, which will rub off that mundaneness and get us start moving the setting into something a whole lot more interesting and distinct than classic Fallout mixed with Stalker. The game is genuinely very humbly priced for the amount of game that you get out of it. As it stands, it's about $17 Canadian and maybe about 15 euros for the Euro goons out there. And if you end up getting it on a sale, then you can expect it for a much more enticing price. Not sure what more I can say. It's a very solid game with a neat world that I think will be greatly expanded on its sequel, Trudograd, which is coming soon, if not already out.
Well, there we got it, fellas. That's pretty much the end of the video. For the people that watched it all the way through, thank you very much for doing so. I appreciate every single one of your views. It really does mean a lot to me. And for some of the people that are new, well, welcome to the channel. I hope you really enjoyed the video, find it striking. Maybe it might, interest you in a little bit of a subscription over here, you know what I'm saying? But regardless, whether or not you want to, I hope you enjoyed it. So with that, this is Tomthechosen1, and I gotta get this damn rifle over here. Yeah. To work both in winter and in summer. So if you don't mind, I'll see you fellas next time.